in this episode. And when you ask which is the best camera for documentation, they're not going to be thinking highly about you. I use a single hand for documenting my cases, and when my equipment becomes very heavy, my hand does start to tremor quite a bit. So although I never use an inbuilt flash for documenting my cases, but I would definitely like to have one on my camera, I feel it's way more simpler to transfer it through the SD card and not the camera per se. Moving on to the next point, but the most important point according to me, and that is your camera should be capable of accepting. Now, I'm sure a lot of people would be eager to know what would be my choice of camera. I would suggest, and if you want to do a little bit of more wildlife photography, and if you're tech savvy, you're listening to the Dental Photography School podcast, where I'll be sharing practical tips on clinical and general photography. I'm Dr. Mayur Davda, and I've been coaching dentists and dermatologists on clinical photography since 2013. If you don't want to miss out on any action, make sure to subscribe to my show because I release an episode every Saturday morning. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dental Photography School podcast. To all my listeners out there, a happy new year 2021. You're listening to the first episode of the new year and I'm so glad to have your company along with this. In this episode, I'll be discussing about which is the best camera for dental photography. In our previous episodes, we discussed about the reverse concept. So, according to the reverse concept, one must invest minimum on the camera, an intermediate amount on the lens, and maximum on the flash, because flash is the equipment which is going to control our images to a very large extent. So, I've seen this very frequently. Whenever somebody sees good documentation, they frequently ask their colleagues, your documentation was really good. Which camera is it that you're using for documenting your cases? Now there's one very useful tip that might make you sound great in front of your colleagues. Never ask your colleagues which is the camera that they use for documentation if you like their documentation. If you want to impress your colleagues, ask them what flash system they are using for documentation purposes. That is because a conditioned dental photographer knows it well that camera matters the least for documentation purposes. And when you ask which is the best camera for documentation, they're not going to be thinking highly about you. So if you want to make a good mark or a good impression in front of your colleagues, never ask them which is the best camera for clinical photography. You should ask them which is the flash source that they use for documenting their cases. Now, let's jump into the topic. Alright, so in this episode, we are going to discuss which is the best camera for clinical photography purposes. But before that, once again, when it comes to investment, one must invest maximum on different flash systems, a moderate amount on the lens, and a minimum amount on the camera. If you're following the reverse concept, trust me, you can never go wrong. So let us see what are the requirements for an ideal camera in clinical photography. Number one, it should be capable of accepting different lenses. In the sense, it should be an interchangeable lens camera. Okay, so if you want to take a picture of a landscape, you should be able to attach a wide angle lens. At the same time, if you wish to use the camera for clinical photography, you should be able to mount a macro lens of your choice. And if you want to take the camera outside for portraits, or if you want to take the camera outside for wildlife photography, you should be able to attach telephoto lenses or portrait lenses for any of the purposes. So it's really important that our camera should be capable of accepting different lenses. In the sense, it should be an interchangeable lens camera. Number 2, it should be light in weight. Now this is a very critical point for all the clinicians out there, because we do not want heavy equipment to be carrying around especially for consultation purposes. So if you're consulting, it's very important that you should have a lightweight camera. But at the same time, if you're not consulting and you're going to be sitting at one place only, in the sense you just have a single practice and you usually work at that practice only and don't go for consultation, still it's important to have a camera which is light in weight, because frequently as a dentist, I have realized that I use a single hand for documenting my cases, and when my equipment becomes very heavy, my hand does start to tremor quite a bit, and I believe that could affect my images. Maybe it could make it blurred if I'm not really careful, or it could make me feel a little awkward in front of my patient, because if the patient is seeing you tremoring in front of himself or herself, they're not going to be thinking highly about you, or maybe they might also get afraid that the camera might fall on them. So having a camera which is lightweight is a very critical thing that I would wish that is present in our camera choice. Number 3, inbuilt flash. Any camera that you choose, make sure that you have an inbuilt flash. So although I never use an inbuilt flash for documenting my cases, but I would definitely like to have one on my camera, just in case my ring flash, twin flash, or my studio light stops working on the trigger mode. Many a times I have forgotten my studio light trigger in my clinic, and when I go out for taking pictures for portraits and for clinical photography as well, I do use studio lights for documenting my cases quite a few times. So if I've forgotten my studio light trigger, there is no way I can fire those studio lights if my camera does not have an inbuilt flash and I don't have any other flash with me. For example, if I don't have a ring flash or a twin flash and I don't even have an inbuilt flash, I might be in a pickle to fire the studio lights if my radio transmitter stops working or if I forget the trigger in my practice. But having an inbuilt flash would always be nice over here, because just in case I've forgotten the trigger in my practice, I can always raise my inbuilt flash, which is also called as the pop-up flash, and use it as a master to fire my studio lights. Alright, so I would definitely take care that my inbuilt flash does not create a visual effect in my images out there. So I'm going to be diffusing it quite heavily. The light intensity should just be enough to trigger the slaves, that is the studio lights. This might be a little complicated for beginners in photography, but trust me, it's really very simple. So if I have to take it from the top, studio lights can be fired by two techniques. One is by the use of radio transmitters and radio receivers, and the other way is using them on slaves. So what do you mean by using them on slaves is, if the studio lights fire when some other flash is firing, which is the master, the studio lights will be called slaves. So the master could be anything. It could be a ring flash, twin flash, or even an inbuilt flash. But when we use a radio transmitter or a radio receiver to fire the studio lights, it's not called as slave. Okay. So the studio lights can be fired in these two techniques, either by a radio receiver or transmitter, or by the use of a master, and in that case the studio lights will be called slaves. So I feel, although I do not use inbuilt flash for documentation per se, they are a good backup to have just in case if I'm forgetting my radio transmitter in my practice. That is important for me. The other uses would be, initially, if you're not planning to invest on a dedicated flash system, inbuilt flash does help you document cases. Although they might not look that great, but it's not going to stop you from your work. You can definitely document your cases using inbuilt flash as well. So I never underestimate the power of an inbuilt flash. Moving on to the next point, that is point number 4. Every camera that we plan to buy must have Wi-Fi. So why do we want our cameras to have Wi-Fi is we can show the pictures that we have shot on the camera on a larger screen. This could be for educating our patients. This could be to educate our colleagues as well. So what I do in my practice is I have a camera which has inbuilt Wi-Fi, which has NFC, which also has Bluetooth. So there are multiple ways in which I can transfer my file to a bigger screen. For example, a tablet or even an Android TV or a smart TV. When I say transfer, I do not literally mean the entire big raw file is getting transferred. But when this Wi-Fi transfer takes place, it is a small file size that is shown on a larger screen. For example, a tablet or a TV. And when you see it on your tab, you have an option to save it or not. But again, you have to keep in mind that this is basically only to educate your patients or your colleagues, because it makes a big impact if you show a particular image on a bigger screen than on a camera screen, because frequently we miss out on details when we see the image on a small screen. So I prefer to take a picture on the dental chair, and when I call my patient on my consultation table, I show them the same picture that's there on my camera on a larger screen, that is my smart TV. This makes a very big impact, and the patients are able to see the problem much more clearly on a bigger screen, which would usually not happen on a camera screen. So Wi-Fi is one of the best things to have in your camera. So see to it that you do not miss out on this particular feature. But again, the bottom line is, when you are transferring the file, just remember a very low resolution file is getting transmitted and not the actual file. I shoot on RAW, so the actual file is a RAW file which is of a very high resolution. If you want to transfer the actual file, you do have to insert the SD card into your laptop if you have an SD card slot, or you should use a memory card reader. These are the ways that you can use your SD card to transfer your files to your PC or a laptop. You can also connect your camera directly through a cable, and you can connect it to your desktop or your laptop. But this is one. So I'm not used to this particular technique of connecting my camera to my laptop. I always prefer removing the SD card and inserting it into my laptop's SD card slot and then transfer the pictures, because I do not have to hold the entire camera with me for that particular purpose. I feel it's way more simpler to transfer it through the SD card and not the camera per se. And also at the same time, when I'm transferring the SD card files, my staff can definitely charge the camera. So it's just a time saver for me, and I can also put it on charging, my camera on charging. But if you connect your camera directly to your laptop, your camera has to be on and the battery does get consumed. So this is probably one reason why I don't like to use it. But subconsciously, I'm also worried about one particular fact, that if my laptop has a virus or a Trojan, I do not want my camera to start behaving weirdly. So I would prefer never to connect my camera to the laptop or the desktop, because I really do not want to invite trouble into my DSLR, right? Moving on to the next point, but the most important point according to me, and that is your camera should be capable of accepting a third-party flash. So what do you mean by a third-party flash? For example, if I have a Canon camera and if I buy a Canon's ring flash, it's the same company. So this is not third party. But if I have a Canon camera and I want to use Elinchrome's Studio Light. So this Elinchrome's Studio Light, because it's not made by Canon, we would call it the third party flash in this particular case. So third party is something which is a third party product is a product which is not made by the company of your camera. So I would although I would love to invest on a ring flash by Canon because I use the Canon, but I would definitely think about upgrading myself someday to studio light. And if you're one of those people like me who loves to use studio lights for documenting cases or for tabletop pictures, or you can also take glamour photography pictures, you need to have a studio light which is also a third party flash. So make sure that your camera is capable of supporting a third party flash. If it's not capable of supporting, you might not be able to use a studio light as easily, or maybe you would never be able to use it. But I would definitely want to keep my option open to use a third party flash in future. So I'll confirm it not once, twice or thrice, but when I buy it from a dealer, I'll make sure to tell him, if my studio light does not work on the camera, I'm definitely going to return it back to you. So having a third party flash support is very, very vital for me in my camera's choice. Other factors that I feel do affect our choices is economics. I would definitely prefer a camera which is economic and budget friendly, so I can invest more on the lens and different flash systems, because I would love to use a ring flash, twin flash as well as studio lights. I would definitely want to invest more on different flash collections rather than investing a heavy amount on camera and regretting later that, oh, I do not have money to buy a lens or a flash now. So that's one thing that's really important for me, economics as well. Now coming to the last point, for people who know, there are two different types of cameras when it comes to interchangeable lens cameras. It's either a crop sensor camera or a full frame DSLR. I would definitely prefer a crop sensor DSLR or a mirrorless camera over a full frame DSLR or a mirrorless camera. Why? Is because number one, they are more light in weight. They are more economic. But the most important reason is most frequently full frame DSLRs or full frame mirrorless cameras do not have an inbuilt flash, which I feel is really important to have. So that is one big loss. If I'm going to the full frame category, I might not get an inbuilt flash, which is like a backup for me, which I would love to have. And last but the most important reason for me is how the camera companies put their lenses in the market. So you need to understand, most frequently what actually happens is that the crop sensor camera users, which are also called as beginner level camera users, and the full frame camera users are usually called professional camera users. So there's a very simple way to explain this, and probably I'm going to try and explain it now. Just to keep it simple, beginner level camera users, or you can say entry level camera users, can use entry level lenses made for them, as well as professional lenses made for professional camera users. That means a crop sensor DSLR user has a wider availability of lenses, a wider choice of lenses at their disposal, which is something that a full frame camera user might miss out on. In other words, a semi-professional or a beginner camera user can use beginner level lenses as well as professional lenses for their uses. However, a professional camera users cannot do that. So keep that in mind. A professional camera users has to buy only professional level lenses. They cannot downgrade or downscale to semi-professional lenses. Okay. The most important point for me is the crop sensor camera users can use both professional lenses as well as semi-professional or beginner level lenses. However, the professional camera users cannot do that. A professional camera user can only use professional lenses made for them. That means the choice of lenses for crop sensor camera users is way more wider as compared to professional camera users, which is a big drawback. So whenever you're planning to buy a lens online, you have to thoroughly look if your lens is actually for professional cameras only, if you are a professional camera users. But people who use crop sensor cameras need not worry so much. They just have to find out, they just have to Google the company that they use. For example, if they're using Canon, they can search for a Canon lens and they can use that particular lens on their camera. They do not have to worry if it's a professional lens or a semi-professional lens, because both these categories are going to fit on a crop sensor DSLR. Alright, so just keep that in mind. Now, I'm sure a lot of people would be eager to know what would be my choice of camera. I particularly would prefer Canon over Nikon. That's the first thing that I'm going to be deciding on. Why I'm going to be choosing Canon over Nikon is probably a completely different thought process altogether. And I think I'm going to be releasing an episode on this, why I would prefer Canon over Nikon for clinical photography. But in a nutshell, I would prefer Canon over Nikon, number one, because it's way more user friendly. Number two is because it has non-image stabilization macro lens, which is a primary requirement for me as a clinician who uses flash all the time. And number three is Canon makes ring flash as well as twin flash, which Nikon does not. Nikon does not make a ring flash. Nikon does make a twin flash. But one of the biggest put-offs for me to not invest more on Nikon is their twin flash also works on a special battery called a CR123, which might be a little awkward to use. For example, if the battery just dies in between a procedure, it's difficult to procure CR123 batteries. However, a Canon's twin flash, or in just say Canon's any flash, works on AA batteries, which are readily available at disposal, and we do have a lot of rechargeable options available for that as well. So really great thought process behind the manufacturing of products by Canon, because they do give a huge thought process behind what the consumers want when it comes to clinical photography, or generally, in fact, for anything, for wildlife photographers or portrait photographers or landscape photographers. They do put in a lot of thought, which I think is, I think Nikon should have given it a thought. So Nikon does make macro lenses for clinical photography, but as far as I know, the macro lenses that are useful for me in the range of 85 to 105, they are all VR lenses, which are very, very heavy. We are going to be discussing this quite in detail. So since we have narrowed down on the company, I would definitely prefer Canon over Nikon, I repeat. And if you ask me the model number, I'd probably go for a model that supports a third-party flash and has Wi-Fi. Now, there was a controversy in between. Okay, so Canon's basic camera would be Canon 1300D, which was an older model which had a successor by the name of Canon 1500D. So initially there was a problem. There was an issue that Canon 1500D did not accept a third-party flash. But the most recent news by Canon is that the Canon 1500D does support the third-party flash now. So, but I would still request all the listeners to exercise caution when buying the Canon 1500D. Just check it once and confirm it from the seller that it does accept a third-party flash. So I would definitely suggest everybody to go ahead and buy Canon 1500D after confirmation that it does accept a third-party flash. Otherwise, it has everything. It is light in weight. It has Wi-Fi. It has inbuilt Wi-Fi. So all in all, a great camera, and it does accept all the lenses that you'd probably want to use for clinical photography. So that's about my personal choices when it comes to a basic model. Now, Canon 1500D comes in two lens kits. One is the 1855 lens kit, which is a single lens kit, and one is an 1855 plus 55-250 lens kit. So there are two lenses in it. I would say that the 55-250 lens is not of much use. So just an 1855 lens is great to buy. But do not make the mistake of buying body only, because the 1855 lens is a very, very handy lens and you can do a lot of things with it, like landscapes as well as great portraits if you really know how to use it. So do not miss out on the 1855 lens, but I'll probably pass the 55-250 option. So I'm not going to be buying the 2 lens kit option. I think I'll be buying the single lens kit option. And that's about it. Do not buy body only. And if you wish to invest a lot more money on the camera, I would suggest, and if you want to do a little bit of more wildlife photography, and if you're tech savvy, I would suggest that you go for the Canon's 80D or 90D. These are great cameras and are very, very, very powerful, but they are really heavy. So do exercise caution when you plan to buy them, because it becomes really difficult to use it with a single hand. So I hope I could satisfy your requirement when it comes to knowing more about which is the best camera for clinical photography. If you do have questions for me, put it down on dentalphotographyschool@gmail.com, or you can also put it in the comments. I'll be looking forward to answer them. Once again, a very happy New Year 2021 to all my listeners. Thank you. That's all we have time for in this episode. If you're getting benefited from my tips, do show your love by leaving a rating and a review. For tutorials on photography, do check out my channel Dental Photography School on YouTube. To participate in contests and live events, join the Dental Photography School Facebook and Telegram group. You can follow me on Instagram as Mayur_EOS Maestro or Dental Photography School. I'll meet you next week. Till then, keep listening, keep sharing.